Hello, hello. Welcome to the first video in my channel. I decided I want to start recording some of the conversations I have with some of the fascinating, interesting people that I'm uh, getting to talk to these days. And this first conversation is with Ramses and Tim. Ramses is someone who's been following and sort of living with the philosophies around Stoicism. Stoicism is something that I've kind of touched on, sort of seen references to in my studies around psychology and meditation and so on. And so I was really curious to learn more, and here's the conversation. I hope you get something out of it. Leave some comments or tweet at us if you have more thoughts and ideas around some of the things we talk about today. Enjoy. All right, first question, Ramsey. So you mentioned the sort of goal. It'd be interesting to get like a quick sense of like what is the goal of Stoicism, like, and sort of how was it founded there? Like, what is the origins that led it to get to
Yeah,
this point where it is now? Just kind of high level
sure,
start.
sure. I want to start with a quote because what Tim said reminded me of a quote by Zeno, and Zeno is the Zeno Citium. He's the founder of Stoicism.
And we'll put links
Um,
to everything you talk about in the show notes
yeah,
after.
yeah, sure. I will link to all the stuff I talk about. So he
Great.
said, well-being is realized with small steps, but is truly no small thing. So I think that's something we need to keep in mind, especially how our interaction started.
Mm-hmm.
That we
Yep.
should strive for well-being, but we should do it in small steps, and then realize where when it accumulates, when it compounds, um, it's like compound interest. Like
Yep.
you
Yep.
get well-being. So well-being, it's the main goal of Stoicism.
And
So
how would
what
you
is what?
define well-being? Yeah. Go ahead
Yeah,
for it.
yeah. So Zeno lived around 300 BCE. So he was from Cyprus. He was a merchant, and he was very wealthy. And he shipwrecked just outside of Athens. I don't remember exactly what year, but I think it was about 12 years before he founded the Stoic school. And he was essentially homeless. He didn't have anything. He lost all his possessions. So he wandered to a bookstore in Athens, and they already had bookstores there because democracy was flourishing. Socrates had been put to death about 80 or 90 years before. And he wandered into the bookstore. He started reading a book by Xenophon. So Xenophon was one of the students of Socrates, and he wrote a book called Memorabilia, which recounts the story of Socrates' life. And he asked the bookstore owner, "Where can I find a man like Socrates?" And as legend had it, has it, a cynic called I think it was Diogenes walked by. So it was you had different philosophical schools, and the cynics were very extreme. So they said if you want to achieve happiness, you need to be excellent. So you need to be virtuous. We'll get into that what it means in a bit.
Mm, mm.
And you can achieve eudaimonia. So what is eudaimonia? It means good spirits. So you can be in good spirits. You can have uh, 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 happy. Nowadays you would say happiness, but it isn't being happy that you're elated, that you're ecstatic. No, it means more like no matter what happens, I know I live a good life. Just having the knowledge of living having a good life no matter your circumstances. Um, and for cynics, the most direct way to that was to strip themselves of all attachments. So they were homeless people. They were homeless
Yep.
philosophers. Diogenes, I think he lived in a tub, so he was living in a public place, and his only goal was to be a good person. So to be wise, to be just, to be courageous, and to be moderate. And especially for cynics, uh, uh, according to them, that was the only way you could be happy. So Zeno lived like that for some years, started to study with some other philosophers, because again, there were Epicureans, there were the skeptics, there were the cynics, of course, the academics of Aristotle. All these different schools, they were competing about what is the best way to achieve happiness. They were all trying to answer the question, what is eudaimonia? And they were, well, they were more or less, they are more or less agreed on that, but the path toward that state, like now we would say being calm, being anxiety free, being more or less careless, that would be eudaimonia. So
Got
that
it.
was the goal.
Interesting.
And yeah, and studying with all these different teachers, thought, there must be there must be a middle way. So you can live for pleasure, like the Epicureans, like enlightened hedonism, or you can live like the cynics, who were ascetics essentially. And just like the Buddha, Zeno said, there must be a middle way.
I see.
So that's how the Stoic
Yeah.
school came to be.
That's super interesting. I was just going to ask, like, it reminded me, I was reading Siddhartha, and any other book that you read around sort of the stories and legends around Buddha, you'll see, like, those groups eventually, as they transition through different sort of states of what they believe is sort of the right way to achieve it. A lot of it comes with suffering and sort of deprivation and, having nothing. And then in that story with Siddhartha, he kind of went the other extreme that you just described, where he was, he was like, I've never experienced women or life or pleasures. And he kind of went all the deep end into that, and kind of eventually found sort of this middle balance. One word that came across as you were describing what this state is sort of contentment, right? Which is sort of like not having a specific attachment to anything. You basically are more free and unaffected by these different inputs. So okay, so it sounds like that's kind of the goal, and one other interesting thought I had was just like imagining like being a fly on the wall during this time of like, can you imagine if like just everywhere, like there were just competing schools right now of people trying to figure out like what is life's sort of answer and happiness and stuff like that, like for folks to take that so seriously, whereas now it's sort of like maybe a question that some folks will eventually hop into and then read a bunch of books about it, but mostly people aren't really asking that question. So I feel like it also highlights such a different time and place that
it was
was.
a cultural thing as well. It was cultural because Athens was a democracy, but they had like 30 tyrants just before, who I mean they didn't take democracy for granted, because it was very young. It was a very young idea, and it had almost gone extinct. So it was an interesting time, I think. So many different ideas, very different perspectives, and so maybe dive into how the Stoics thought that they could answer that question. So Zeno said the goal of life. It's not to, the goal itself shouldn't be happiness. Happiness is actually a byproduct of the goal. And the goal in life is to live according to nature, which is pretty abstract if you just leave it at that. So what does that mean? Living in agreement with nature, in harmony with nature. The Stoics, they were like pantheists. So they saw themselves as part of a bigger system, and that bigger system was God, or is God. So the cosmos, the universe is God, and everything is part of God. Even a stone, even this spoon, it's part of God. Everything.
Yep.
And what is our nature? So what is it that that makes a human unique? There's one thing that sets us apart from everything else. That's our consciousness, our type of consciousness. So it's our rationality, as Stoics would say. So they believe if you look in the universe, you saw you saw an intelligence, like you saw different systems, and there was a intelligence underlying that. There was like and they call it the logos. So there was some kind of rationality underlying the different systems. So cycles of seasons, of the planets, constellations, everything, there is some type of intelligence in that. And our rationality, according to the Stoics, because they were religious, was okay. Our rationality, it's like a defined spark. So the fact that we can think of the past and the future and can make choices puts us in a position that's almost akin to God, because we can set things in motion, and we can come to understand what is the best way to live in our case, because there is a best way to live. To really be a human, to really make most of being human. There is a way. There is a good and wrong.
Right.
There is a good way to live that benefits you as a person. So getting enough rest, eating, all those things, all those instincts are part of your nature. But also how you talk to yourself, how you talk to others, which is a conscious decision you can take. You should think about what is the best way to live, what is the best way to act in the world, so that I benefit myself, but also benefit others. Because again, we are part of a larger system. So if I screw you over, indirectly, I will screw myself over. So that is very important.
Very interesting. Tim, feel free to jump in if you had questions.
I have one question that was super interesting that you said about the youth of Athens democracy. How old was it during this time? Because I thought that was really interesting. Of their kind of you said it was young, so they really respected that and wanted it to work out. So
yeah, I don't know exactly. I should dive into that. I think, at least, I mean, we know it was around. Democracy was already around when Socrates lived, so that was around 400 BC. But I can't remember. I can't remember exactly when it came to be. I mean, it was a process, obviously, but there was a time that, and they call it the time of the 30 tyrants. So there was a group of 30 men that was essentially, it was a dictatorship, and people knew how fickle freedom was. And in those times, especially discussing complex ideas, so you had the sophists who were really good at defending any point they wanted to defend. So language and reason and logic really came into play back then. So people really started to think about, okay, if we do this, then that will be the result. So I mean, that is logic, essentially, that you take an input and you have an output.
Right. I'm actually really curious, like, do you think there's a connection between the political situation there and sort of the structure of how society was run with that cultural aspect of being debate oriented and so on? Like, I think it's really interesting, especially again, the contrast where we are today, where nuanced debate is like, just becoming more and more a rare occasion, and rather like sort of consuming some really surface level information, and it's creating a serious problem. What is it that you think drove that? Like, sometimes, you think and hear about all these philosophers like debating and sitting around. It's like, what was it about the culture then that made that like fine and sort of so prevalent?
Yeah, well, I mean, Socrates was a rebel in a sense because he was just very annoying for many people because he was always asking very difficult questions.
Yeah.
He said, I know one thing, and that is that I know nothing. That's the only thing he knew, and that's why he was always asking questions. And everyone was so certain about their view of the world.
Mm.
And he was always questioning that. And actually,
Yeah.
that was one of the reasons he was put to death because they found him annoying.
Wow.
And but when that, I mean, almost 100 years later, I think obviously this is projection, but I think people were so shocked by what they did to Socrates. And again, it's projection that they thought, okay, we need to rethink how we handle t- tough questions and difficult people. But the genie was out of the bottle anyway
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
Plato was very good at promoting the ideas of Socrates.
Yeah.
Xenophon, there were other students, and from that, many schools were started. Just groups of people discussing, okay, how can we live the best life possible?
Yep.
And in many cultures, obviously, there were religions, and everyone had to follow the same religion, or if you were deviating from it, you were put to death.
Yeah.
Whereas in Greece, in Athens, they were like, oh no, let's hear this person out and let's contemplate, let's think about what this person said, and instead of killing this person because they say something we don't like, let's
Yeah.
argue with them. So
Yeah.
let's have an open dialogue instead of using physical violence. I think that was a
Right.
very important difference as well.
Right. I think it was interesting. It makes me think there was someone who had asked on Twitter, you know, it's like someone was describing their Twitter feed of just like, when I go on Twitter, there's all these people like, philosophizing about like, the future of humanity and this and this and that. And I just wondered like, why don't these conversations happen in real life? And someone else just responded that it's like on Twitter, I just tweet about what I'm thinking and what I'm learning, and no one tells me to be quiet.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just different because in like, if you're in a party and you're just sitting there and we're having even this conversation, it's kind of like, cool, all right, well, like maybe, that's great, like and so I think there is a cultural aspect that just sort of um it's self-reinforcing, right? So
Yeah.
because you see those conversations on Twitter, you feel more comfortable sharing, like as you did, as Tim did, as I did, just sort of having this conversation. So in some ways, you can there is a bit of that even on Twitter and probably other places, which is interesting. I do want to just jump back in and ask. Okay, so we've got our foundation. Um, you know, what does one need to do differently in their life to be a good Stoic, or to implement these philosophies, like
Yeah.
and yeah, and then after that, I'd love to dive into also like once they do that, like what are some of the returns they should expect to see, or what are the expectations they should have around how it might
Yeah.
affect their life.
Yeah, yeah. So, like I said, Zena said we should live in agreement with nature. So we should be aware of our nature, but we should also be aware of what is the wider system. So and it comes back in this time as well with the environment. How do we take care of the earth, of our surroundings, of the people, and then we can achieve a smooth flowing life. So happiness, eudaimonia, and to reach that, according to Zeno, so he was like a mild-mannered cynic, and the cynic said you have to live virtuously. So you have to strive for excellence of character. So there, according to cynics, but also Stoics, there is no there is no concept of evil. There is no concept of good. There's nothing is inherently good or evil. It's only how we choose to make use of our capacities that in our acts or in our thinking we are good or bad. So there's only moral evil and moral good. So what does it look like? To avoid moral vice, we should strive to have an excellent character. So we should strive to be wise. We should strive to be just, so justice. We should strive to be courageous, because sometimes we have to do things that we are afraid of, but should still do it regardless. And we should strive for moderation. And so the 4 Stoic virtues are wisdom, applied wisdom, practical wisdom, justice, courage, and moderation. And if you live according to those 4 virtues, if you strive to be better in each of those areas, you will achieve eudaimonia. You will achieve a smooth flowing life. And there are different ways you can cultivate wisdom, like prudence. So foresightedness, that you think, okay, what I'm going to do now, what consequence will have my actions in the present?
Right.
And how do you know that? By learning from your past, but not ruminating, because that's very important. Stoicism is very much a here and now philosophy. So one of the principles is, obviously, you make your future in this present moment. You cannot change the past. You can, the present or the future is not here yet. But in this present moment, you can, using your rationality, using your type of consciousness that you have as a human, you can apply wisdom. You can be good for other people. You can show justice. You can be courageous, but you can also be moderate. So if you overeat in the moment, it can be very pleasurable, but how will you feel in 2 hours? And that's always something that a Stoic would ask him or herself. Okay, how is this present action going to affect future? And there are a few more things, and which I do want to dive into.
I had a quick question. So
yeah,
a lot of these core principles, like one of the things that one can find is like, religions of different kinds all have sort of, different stories and different sort of prescriptions of what are the key things to focus on. Would you describe Stoicism as a religion?
No.
You mentioned like these 4 components to it. Okay, the answer is no. So
no, but I will. But they were religious, but I wouldn't call it a religion, and I will explain in a bit why. But
go for
continue. Okay, so I mean, Stoicism is a philosophy, and what does philosophy mean? It means love for wisdom. Philosophia. So philo means love, Sophia means wisdom. So and a Stoic wouldn't say, "Oh, I am inspired by God." Stoic doesn't gain insight through divination or revelation. They come to their conclusions through reasoning, through scientific reasoning, so logic. And that is, I think, the key distinction between a philosophy and a religion. Because in a religion, you have a set of rules. And when you ask someone, how did you come to these rules? A religious person would say, oh, obviously, they came through us by God.
Right.
And there was maybe a middleman in there, or some religions will have personal revelations. But again, they see it as coming from God.
Yeah.
A philosopher says, no, I have my mental capabilities, and through my mental capabilities, I can find the way that most benefits me in this life. And to really ask those questions, I think, is the mark of a philosopher. This meeting has been upgraded. Okay, I got a notification. Yeah. So
okay, that's really interesting. I'm gonna prod you a bit more here. This is super fascinating. So okay, so let's talk about
no, Tim has a question, I think, or not.
Oh yeah, go ahead, Tim. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just gonna add, it seems like on the Stoic philosophy point, that the story of how Stoicism occurred isn't relevant to to
No.
practicing Stoicism, which is a really important distinction. So when you
Mm,
talk about Christianity, the story of Christianity is important in the
absolutely.
practice, where Stoicism, everything prior in this conversation, the understanding why it is not relevant. It's really interesting, but
No, it's not.
it's the
No.
practice today that's important.
Yeah, and Zeno saw himself as a student. He never claimed to be a sage. He never claimed to be anything. Actually, no Stoic scholar, they called them, so they were heads of the school. There were, I think, in total were 9 or 10 scholars. Uh, they never regarded themselves as sages. They all regarded themselves as students, like the people they were teaching, but they were just a little bit further along. So they were able to show the path because they were walking a few steps in front of the rest. So that's the only difference. And then Stoicism also went through transformations because they came to new insights. They interacted with other philosophical schools, and they were like, this is an interesting idea. Maybe we should adopt it, and really look at reality and understanding, okay, how does reality work, and what is the best way to interact with reality. But obviously, we most live in our minds, and everything that happens to us is filtered through our minds. And we have all this conditioning from society, from our parents. I want to cross over to the one of the main ideas in Stoicism. So I'm going to share my screen,
Go
if
for
that's
it.
possible. To see.
Hopefully, I don't have to do any. No, yeah.
No, I don't think
I
so.
think I
Okay.
think I think you can do it. Yeah, go for
All
it.
right. So tell me when you can see my screen.
Yep, we can see it.
All right, cool. So can you still see my screen?
Nope.
Oh,
Undo whatever you just did.
okay, now
There.
now
Yeah.
it is. Now it is.
Okay.
Okay. So this is the Enchiridion. This is the manual. It's a book composed by a student of Epictetus. Epictetus was a Stoic philosopher teacher in the first century. Am I saying that correctly? First or second century? He lived before Marcus
Sure.
Aurelius. Marcus
Sure.
Aurelius
Sure.
was from the second century, and he didn't write anything. He was just having dialogues with his students in his school. And this is one of the most important ideas in Stoicism, because if we talk about okay, how do we interact with reality and what should we focus on, and we should apply logic. That is just the message. So one of the most important ideas about reality in Stoicism is this first one. So things,
Go.
some are in our power and others are not. In our power, our opinion, movement toward a thing, desire, aversion, turning from a thing. And in a word, whatever are our own acts. Not in our power are the body, property, reputation, offices, and in a word, whatever is not our own acts. And the things in our power are by nature free, not subject to restraint or nor hindrance, but the things not in our power are weak, slavish, subject to restraint in the power of others. So I think this is one of the most important ideas in Stoicism, because the only thing we truly can control is our own mind, and even that is now, with modern insights, we realize even that is limited, but we cannot control anything outside of us. um, and that is, I think this is one very important idea in Stoicism. They call this a dichotomy of control. So everything in reality you can divide into two things, which is things you can control and things you cannot control. And if you focus on the things you can control, you will not be hindered. So you can think the thoughts that you want if you put your mind to it. That is the message, more or less.
Got it.
And
Yeah.
if we do that, if we only focus on what we can control, our thoughts, our own actions, then you get the virtues. Then you get, okay, how do you apply wisdom? You have to ask yourself that. And how can I apply wisdom in this specific situation? How can I be just? How can I be good toward others in this situation? How can I be courageous? How can I be moderate? And then when you ask yourself that continuously, obviously there's more to this. If you ask yourself this continuously, you come to a few other conclusions. For example, if your mind is the only thing you can control, how do you control it? Because again, we are conditioned by everything around us. And then another idea that is very important in Stoicism, I think, let's see. Yes, number 5 here. Men are disturbed not by the things which happen, but by the opinions about the things. For example, death is nothing terrible, because if it were, it would have seemed so to Socrates. For the opinion about death, that it is terrible, is the terrible, terrible thing. When we are impeded or disturbed or grieved, let us never blame others but ourselves, that is, our opinions. It is the act of an ill-instructed man to blame others for his own bad condition. It is the act of one who has begun to be instructed to lay the blame on himself, and of one whose instruction is completed, neither to blame another nor himself. So it's not, again, it's not the event or the situation you see yourself faced with that you are disturbed by. It's only the label that you attach to it. So if you say, oh, I lost my job, this is horrible, then it is horrible. But if you think, oh, I was fired, I got some money, I can maybe finally follow my passion. The same situation is interpreted in a completely different way. It's still the same situation, but you tell the story to yourself.
Yep.
And that's the only thing you can control ultimately.
Yeah,
So I think that is
of course
very
resonate
important.
heavily with this. Like we were just talking about this right this morning. Super interesting that to see the philosophies here like this, because we were just talking about like the Adlerian psychology teachings that I had written about, where you basically separate tasks is one of the key ones, right? Like what are the things that you can control and are responsible for versus others. A second
Yes.
one, like in altering your reality, like actually choosing to label the past with meaning, rather than just allowing it to determine what it meant by itself, like basically choosing a different meaning for the past based on like what. So that's super interesting. I think like, I wonder if those like principles about, attaching meaning to the past and about attaching ownership and responsibility between us as societies are so like core fundamental that they're probably prevalent in lots of different schools of thought. But so those are super interesting. I don't know if there was something else you wanted to touch on really quick there, but I think one interesting question I have is around God. So you mentioned that it's not a religion. However, like there is, as part of Stoicism, this sort of awareness that God is in everything, and that I guess it sounded like sort of enables you to, or I guess endows you with this like responsibility to decide what are the right things to do, but there's no like search for the special divine thing, right? Like there's no search for some special God or connection or whatnot. So I'm trying to contrast some of these ideas in my head, and the closest thinking that I can think of is around some of the teachings and learnings you'll see around Buddhism, where again they are not meant to be prophets or sages, just people that had gone further in their journey of sort of spiritual connection and what have you. And I guess it would be interesting to hear you sort of like in your mind sort of how do you contrast that? Because one of the things that always comes up for me is, when you let's talk about, let's say, meditation, for example. Like, you are basically accessing yourself, and then you're removing these sort of illusions that we have of like me, and sort of like who, my own thoughts, versus just sort of being connected to something larger. But you do have this sort of path. There's sort of a directional search towards, enlightenment or divine connection or something. And,
Yeah.
one thing I've heard from you is like, there's specifically not that search, and so,
Well,
or maybe I
it's
misinterpret.
nuanced. No,
Yeah.
it's nuanced. I mean, I think for modern Stoics, the majority doesn't call themselves religious, but the ancient Stoics did feel like they expressed their love toward God, like toward the cosmos, because
Okay.
there's the hymn to Zeus, so they call God nature, but they also call God Zeus. So they use the language of their time, but they attached a different meaning to it. So if we say God in this time, we are conditioned to think of the Abrahamic God. So the God of the Bible, the God of the Quran, and we maybe we see an old man in the sky with a gray beard. That's what most people visualize. But that's not the God of the Stoics. The Stoic God is you, is me. A little bit like Hindus would see
Yeah.
them. Like when someone reaches enlightenment, and they say, "Oh, I am God," it doesn't mean they are the Almighty. They are the external God of the Abrahamic religions. No, it means they realize they are part of a larger system.
Right.
At least that's. I mean, I wouldn't classify myself as an enlightened being, so I don't know how that would be. But yeah, and so ancient Stoics were definitely religious, but they didn't rely on revelation. So they saw their gift from God, from the cosmos, from nature, their rationality, and they said we can live our best life possible using our own faculties without external faculties. So I think that's why I wouldn't classify Stoicism as a religion. And there is a path, because there are the three disciplines to be found in Epictetus' words. So there's the discipline of desire. So we need to condition our desires and aversions. So we shouldn't desire what is inappropriate for us, but we shouldn't feel an aversion towards certain things. So it's always, and how do I say it? Underlying that is Stoic physics. So this idea about how reality functions, how the cosmos functions. Then you also have the discipline of action. That means, okay, how should we treat our fellow human beings, people around us? And then there is the discipline of assent, which essentially means, how do I live with myself? How do I talk to myself? So you have these three areas: the large cosmos, nature as a whole, like metaphysics, maybe even. So that it certainly has some religious elements in it, I would say, because ancient Stoics did believe that the cosmos will burn up at some point, and there will be a reset, and there will be a new big bang, and everything will start all over again, like it's cyclical. Then there's this theory about discipline of action. How should we live with our fellow humans? And then there is the discipline of assent, of judgment. How do we talk to ourselves? So what are the stories that we tell ourselves? So there's certainly a path, but it's divided up into different parts. And I think the discipline of desire is mostly ignored right now by modern Stoics, because it has a lot of religious undertones. And ethics and logic, so sense, is the main focus, I would say, nowadays. So you see a lot of So for example, Tim Ferriss and Ryan Holiday, they really like to talk about Stoic ethics, so discipline of action. Then you see modern psychotherapies like cognitive behavioral therapy,
Yep.
rational emotive behavioral therapy, REBT. They are based mostly on Epictetus's writings, not writings, but sayings, and that is mostly the domain of logic. So you do see how modern insights are still used, and in those disciplines there are exercises like journaling, like self-affirmations, all those things that ancient Stoics talked about, that can still be found and are still practiced. So
Got it.
there is a path, and there are stories, there are moral stories, but they're all based on Greek myths. So, and I think you see the same thing in Buddhism. I mean, you can see, for example, the hells and the heavens as literal places, or you can see them as mental states.
Yep.
And you see that especially in Western Buddhism, that the hells and the
Yep.
heavens are mostly treated as mental states that you can be in, depending on your practice, how
Right.
you live. But that doesn't exist in Stoicism. That they do say you will feel miserable if you attach your happiness to things that are outside of you, things you cannot control. You will feel unhappy, and you will feel happy if you control the things that you can if you focus on the things you can control. But there are no metaphysical hells or heavens or anything. No.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds, there's so many I guess in some cases strong and in some cases weaker sort of connections to these ideas coming out of, you know, this concept that, you know, God is in everything, that's shared among a few different modes of thinking, or this concept of what you just described around you know, heaven or hell being more of a mental construct. Super interesting. You know, there's one thing you just said I wanted to ask about. So I noticed you said there's one part, I think, around desire, which is sort of less discussed and adopted. And you hinted like it's because it has sort of religious connotations that it's sort of being downplayed.
Yeah.
Does that, at least to me, like, does that mean, like, I guess is part of sort of the adoption or sort of embracement of this philosophy around rejecting sort of traditional religious ideas? And you know, I'm only curious about that because sometimes I do feel like you know, folks can grow up and feel kind of disillusioned by either the religion that they were taught growing up, or just
Yeah.
by religions in general. And so the context of how they approach any philosophy is like, I want something that's not that,
Yeah.
but, you know, but still has, you know, it's sort of philosophies and approaches and ways of becoming a better person, or, you know, and like, it reminds me a lot of when sometimes when I'm talking to my brother or others, even, you know, about Islam, like the things that we like to take away are like, well, you know, being a good human to other people, like that's the foundational, like basic thing, you know, being considerate and thoughtful and not in extreme, being in moderation, like a lot of these core ideas. I feel like, especially in society today, we have so many people, right, that are trying to find something else. Do you feel like that has like colors some of the approach of Stoicism, or am I overinterpreting that one bit?
There are different camps. I mean, overall, I would say Stoicism is a big tent philosophy. So there is, I mean, I was in Athens in October, so there's a yearly conference called Stoic Con. And last year it was in Athens, and I met fierce atheists, and I met also Christians, and they all profess to be practicing Stoics. I mean, for example, Stoic physics, it says, okay, there is a web of cause and effect. They call that fate. I mean, most modern scientifically oriented people would say, yes, there is a web of cause and effect.
Yeah.
I mean, time moves in one way, and yeah. But Then there's also the assumption by any ancient Stoics, and the way everything turns out is for the best, is the best way possible for the universe as a whole. So again, that's also why Stoics say there's no good inherent good and bad, because what is bad for you, first of all, it's an interpretation. But
Yep.
even if you lose a leg,
Yep.
who knows, for the greater good, it's good. So
Yep.
and many moderns reject that. They say no, certain things are just horrible, and we cannot say this is for the best. We cannot know, and that's fair. I mean, some people reject that. So other people want to accept that because they do find a sense of relief from it, just like a religious person would find relief. So, like everything is predetermined, and God,
Yeah.
the way it's mysterious. You know, some people find relief in that, and there's room for everything, because again, the only thing a Stoic has to do to be a Stoic is to live according to the four virtues. So it's you strive to be wise, you strive to be just, you strive to be courageous, and you strive to be moderate in everything that you do. And as long as you strive for that, yeah, you can call yourself a Stoic student. If obviously if you align yourself with that. But I mean, in Stoic circles, there are often examples of modern people, and they're like, oh, 5 Stoic lessons from Gordon Ramsay, for example, whatever.
Got it.
So there is the concept of the sage, of the perfect person in Stoicism. It's a
Yep.
hypothetical perfect being, because again, Stoics said probably the only person that came close to this are just a few people. But we should always strive to be that
Right.
person. So there is a right way to live. You may need to have some motivation for it to be able to do that. Maybe you need to believe in the cosmos as a conscious being. Fine. If you don't believe that, also fine, as long as you live in accordance with the 4 virtues, and you strive to be the best human being you can be. And
Awesome.
you will achieve happiness regardless if you live that way. So it's
I
not,
think
there's no
that's
belief
yeah.
that's
Yeah.
necessary.
I think that makes a ton of sense. I think that's a great place to end, actually, is on
Yeah.
those 4. I
We
have
talk a
one.
lot of time
Yeah,
about
I think
this.
there's a lot to digest there, and
Yeah.
I was just gonna Tim, did you have any burning last questions you wanted to prod over?
I think we kind of circled through that really good. That was an
Great.
amazing overview.
Yeah,
So
thank you so much, Ramses. One final question I would ask is, what are the top recommendations you'd have of books, podcasts, or anything for anyone who wants to learn more about Stoicism? We can put some links in the description here.
Yeah, we'll gather some links. I would say for books, obviously the ancient Stoics, Marcus Aurelius, Meditations. This is personal diary. Epictetus, Discourses and the Handbook. And then there's Seneca, Letters to Lucilius, so Letters from a Stoic. Very, very interesting work. Maybe not the best way to start. So I would start with a Guide to the Good Life by Bill Irvine, How to Be a Stoic by Massimo Pigliucci, Stoicism and the Art of Happiness by Donald Robertson. Those are 3 really good introductory texts. And then podcasts, there are many. I mean, I will put a link to my website. I have a bunch of
I was gonna say, probably on your website there's a good place to go to get a bunch of these links.
practicalstoicism.com. Practicalstoicism.com. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Ramses, and thanks, Tim, for joining as well. This was very enlightening, and look forward to learning more and
let's do this another time.
Sounds good.
And maybe really dive into meditation, because this time we didn't really talk about meditation.
We didn't get a chance. We had a lot to talk about in Stoicism, but yes, it would be wonderful to talk more about meditation and not just sort of the different approaches we take, but sort of how that fits into these philosophies. What part of the puzzle that it is. Cool. All right. Thanks.
All right.